My 4-year-old sleeps in the same room as my 5-year-old, two twin beds. The 5-year-old wants to sleep in her own room, but the 4-year-old will not sleep without her in his room. Terrified of sleeping alone, he cries, screams, vomits from screaming, shakes in terror, beats the door. So I keep her sleeping in there because it keeps the peace. So she's like, any advice would be much appreciated. I guess how to get the 4-year-old to be okay with being alone in the room, and now also give the 5-year-old autonomy to be
Yeah.
in the room.
So that's always tough when you're trying to meet the needs of two different kids and they have opposite needs. That's always a challenge of parenting. I think that we have it really wrong when it comes to kids and sleep across the board. Falling asleep and going to sleep and staying asleep is the hardest exercise in self-regulation that kind of exists in childhood, I think. Falling asleep from a mammal perspective is a very vulnerable, dangerous thing to do because we're not aware of predators.
We're not going to be able to fight a fight.
Exactly. So that's why kids have a lot of fears. It's really hard for them to do that. And some kids are much more prone to fears and anxieties than other kids. And developmentally, it's not linear. So it's not uncommon at all for kids to have separation anxiety from their parents, like, in infancy and toddlerhood, and then again at ages 4 and 5. And here's why. Developmentally, they now have greater cognitive capacity so they can imagine scarier things happening. They start wondering what happens if something happens to mom and dad, they can imagine scarier monsters. So they really have the cognitive capacity to imagine scarier things without the emotional breaks to regulate those new cognitive capacities. So people think of it as a regression. It's actually a progression that hasn't yet sorted itself out. So here's where I think we really mess up though. In order to fall asleep, you have to feel safe. So our nervous systems have to feel safe in order to go to sleep, which is hilarious. Why I remember one time yelling at my kid, go to sleep.
Great. That's counterproductive.
That's impossible. You can't go to sleep if someone's screaming at you, So I think the big thing, and there would be a lot of experts who would disagree with me. So obviously do your due diligence. But I think the worst thing we can do to force kids into sleep is to force them to be in more toxic levels of stress and fear. We want our kids to feel that sleep is desirable and safe and comfy and cozy. So what we want to do is create a lot of associations of feeling safe. If we create more associations of fear and aloneness and all of those things, it's going to take even longer for your child to feel safe going to sleep. And your child will learn, if I'm afraid, they kind of get stuck in a paradox. If I'm afraid and I'm going to get in trouble if I go out and talk to my parents, or I go and say I can't go to sleep, I'm stuck either feeling really afraid and alone or getting in trouble. And it really leaves our kids in a biological paradox.
Oh, that's a conundrum. Yeah.
It really is. And it's a stress state either way, right? And remember, the purpose of attachment is to help regulate our children's physiological states and their emotions so that they feel connected and protected and safe. So what I would say is working with your 4-year-old, and it may take some time. It's okay, parents. Everybody do what works for you. I think the sleep solution that gets the most people the most amount of sleep is the right sleep solution. That might mean children on the floor on a pallet in your room. It might mean you helping your child fall asleep at 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. I promise they don't want you in their rooms as they get older, as they're falling asleep. But that means if you have to lie down with your child until he falls asleep and he feels safe, or you say, I'll be back in 3 minutes to check on you. And you make sure you're back in 3 minutes. So you're predictable. And then you go, okay, now I'm going to go brush my teeth and put on my pajamas. I'll be back in 7 minutes and I'll come back and check on you. So what you're trying to do is expand your child's window of tolerance. You're pushing him outside of his comfort zone a little bit, but not so far that he gets flooded with fear where he goes, that was so terrible. I can never do that again. In fact, I need more. So we're really doing a combination of pushing with a lot of cushion. This might mean guided things that he's listening to about, hot air balloons, traveling and looking at the land. And he's listening to that as he falls asleep. It might mean you being in the room. It might mean you checking every so often. It might mean the 4-year-old falling asleep on the floor in the 5-year-old's room, and then you moving the 4-year-old into their room. It's going to change over time. But what I would hold in your mind as you're making decisions is if you create positive, safe associations with sleep, this will stay a problem much, much, much shorter period of time rather than having your child go, sleeping is really scary and I'm going to have issues around this for a long time.
Actually, the funny thing is, person I interviewed for the podcast, she's a pediatric sleep consultant, and she very much echoed what you just said, is what works for you. It doesn't have to be what the society is saying. Like we talked about having the kids sleep next to you. If they don't have to sleep in the bed, they can sleep in the room with you.
Yep.
I remember complaining to my mom about my daughter when she was like 2.5, and she started saying there was monsters under the bed and she wants to come sleep in my bed. And my mom goes, I don't know why you're complaining. You slept with us until you were 6.
Karma.
I was like, oh, and this has been a child that has slept in her room since she was 7 weeks old. And now suddenly it's feeling like I was failing because I was just like, I don't want the drama in the middle of the night. So just come start the night here and we're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And talking to Kim Davis last week just helped me be okay with my decision that if that was what was soothing for her, she's still using a pacifier to sleep at 3 years old. I made peace with that because, again, I want sleep to be a good thing because I love to sleep. So I want my kid to love to sleep so we can all sleep in this house. And so I don't want the fear around the sleep.
Yeah. And I think we do so much fear-based parenting. Like, oh, if you let the kids sleep in bed with you, you'll never get them out. Or, if you help them get dressed when they can get dressed by themselves, they'll never learn to dress themselves. All of that is BS. Kids learn to do things. And in fact, the attachment science, decades and decades of it say that if we push independence prematurely, and it overwhelms their nervous system's capacity to navigate that stress, it actually makes them more dependent. It's counterproductive. Children move to independence when they're developmentally ready and feel safe enough to do it. I promise the things that you worry about, your children will get there developmentally, and we don't have to spend so much time being afraid. We so easily are like, if I let them sleep in the bed with me, they'll never learn to be independent. And eventually, we make up in our minds that they're going to be drug dealers who live in a van down by the river and never be in a relationship. We make this stuff up.
Yeah.
It's fine. And it's thinking too, it feels so yummy and safe and cozy and wonderful to have their parent near them when they're falling asleep. It's just incredibly pleasurable for them and they feel so good. And it's so good for the relationship. I know you want an evening too, and you want time by yourself and you have things to do and you want time with maybe your significant other, but it often is a lot shorter if you just stay in the room. My kid totally by 8 could, like my youngest, he's the baby, so he took longer to do everything. But by 7 or 6, 7, 8, he could totally go to sleep on his own in his room without any trouble. But he wanted me to stay. He's like, can you just stay for a little while? And he was my baby and I knew how fast it would go. So I was like, and I was sad when he was like, I don't really need you to read to me anymore. I want to read myself, and so, just don't be so fear driven. They will get there. If your kid is like 15 and still wanting to sleep in the bed with you, yes, call me. But I promise this won't happen. I've never once had that happen.
I'm Shira Bergbauer, and you're listening to an excerpt from the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. You can listen to the whole episode wherever you get your podcasts, and look out for new episodes out every Monday. You're doing a great job, Mama. I'll see you next week. Bye now.